Welcome students of Standard 9. Today we are going to start with a new chapter, that is pollination and fertilization. This is from the flower chapter, continuation of the flower chapter. Now pay attention. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or two different flowers on the same plant. This pollination is of different types. Self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, let's see what is self-pollination. Self-pollination is the transference of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower, or from the anther of the flower to the stigma of another flower borne on the same plant. That means two flowers of the same plant or a single flower. It should be a bisexual flower. It occurs only in bisexual flowers which has both anthers and which has both androecium and gynoecium. Self-pollination generally occurs, as I told, in bisexual flowers, but if pollination takes place between two flowers borne on the same plant, it is known as geitonogamy, while that within the same flower is called autogamy, which means if the pollen grains are carried from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, it is autogamy. From the anther to the stigma of two different flowers borne on the same plant is called geitonogamy. Next, let's see what are the advantages of self-pollination. Self-pollination preserves the parental traits and characters indefinitely because the pollen grains are not transferred from one flower to another flower of two different plants. It is of the same plant or flowers of the same plant or of the same flower. That is why they preserve the parental traits. In the bisexual flower, self-pollination ensures seed production as both stamens and carpels they mature at the same time. The flowers which do not have external devices for attracting pollinating agents undergo self-pollination. As pollen grains need to be transferred to a flower of another plant, so there is no wastage of pollen grains. Let's see what are the disadvantages. If this self-pollination continues generation after generation, then the plants they become weak. That may lead to loss in vigor, quality and vitality of the species. The weak and abnormal characters, if present in the breed, they continue to appear in the next generations, which means if there is any disease present in the plant, that will continue. If there is abnormality in the plant, that same abnormality continues. That is a disadvantage. And there is no genetic variation in the next generation due to lack of intermingling of different characters. There is no change in any genetic variation because the same genetic genes are carried from plant to plant. Next, what is cross-pollination? The transference of pollen grains from the anther of a flower of a plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant but of the same species is called cross-pollination. Cross-pollination occurs both in unisexual as well as in bisexual flowers. It brings variations in the offsprings because they are flowers of the different plants but of the same species. They bring variations in the offsprings. Nature favors cross-pollination. There are some adaptive features which are responsible for cross-pollination in plants. Unisexuality. The unisexual flowers may be borne on the same plant or on two separate plants. There are unisexual flowers are either male flowers or female flowers. This condition favors cross-pollination. Next, self-sterility is another adaptive feature. In certain plants, pollen grains are unable to fertilize the eggs of the same flower because of sexual incompatibility. Therefore, in these plants, cross-pollination is the only method, as in case of tea, orchids, potato, etc. Third adaptive feature is dichogamy. In many bisexual flowers, the anther and the stigma often mature at different times. Such a condition is called dichogamy. Some flowers, only anthers mature. In some flowers, the pistil or the pistil matures. So, in many bisexual flowers, the anther and the stigma often mature at different times. That is explained as such. This condition is called dichogamy. Maybe protandry if androecium is developing earlier, or protogyny if gynoecium develops earlier. Because of these different timings of maturity, such flowers, they undergo cross-pollination only. Then, what are the different types of dichogamy? One is protogyny and other one is protandry. Protogyny means, proto means first, gyne means gynoecium. Gynoecium develops earlier. We call it as, then gynoecium, that is a carpel or the pistil, develops earlier than androecium. So it is called as protogyny. In protogyny, the stigma of the flower matures earlier than the anthers, as observed in the flowers of people, custard, etc. And protandry, you can see the picture. In this condition, the anthers mature earlier. Proto means first, andry means androecium. Androecium matures earlier than gynoecium. In this condition, anthers mature earlier than the stigma. So, protandry is exhibited in flowers of China rose, cotton, sunflower, sweet pea, etc. Then there is another condition called as heterostyly. Here the plants, they bear flowers of two different types with respect to the length of the stamens and styles. We can see in different flowers, in some flowers the styles are longer, in some flowers the style is shorter. So in such a condition, the stamens, in some flowers the stamens are long, style is short, or style is long, stamens are short. That is called as heterostyly. Different lengths of anthers and the different lengths of stamens and the style. In such case, flowers undergo cross-pollination as in linseed, oxalis, etc. Hercogamy. Hercogamy means the barrier. As in pansy flowers, you can see hercogamy is a barrier for self-pollination. That means anthers from the same flower producing pollen grains cannot reach, these pollen grains cannot reach the stigma because of the barrier. So stamens and carpels may lie at certain distance from each other. Anthers may be facing outwards, away from the stigma, or they may be inserted within the corolla tube. Example is pansy flower. Advantages of cross-pollination. It increases the vigor and vitality of the plants, which results in much healthier offsprings because two flowers of different plants undergo this pollination. The offsprings thus are better adapted to conditions of environment. New varieties can be produced by cross-pollination. Cross-pollination generally gives rise to comparatively more viable seeds with a better germinating capacity. The disadvantages are, it is less economical and there is more wastage of pollen grains as they move from one flower to another flower, or they may be carried by, as they are carried by insects, winged or water, there is a loss to wastage of pollen grains in case of cross-pollination, as cross-pollination is always dependent upon pollinating agents. The flowers are generally large, colorful, scented, and with abundant nectar to attract pollinating agents. A lot of plant energy is wasted in producing such flowers. These are the disadvantages of cross-pollination. Thank you, students. We'll continue in the next class with agents of pollination.